Welcome. I'm speaking to you from Victoria in British Columbia on the traditional, ancestral and unceded, largely unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking people. And just reflecting on a couple of things that Felix said in his introduction about what's in and out of scope, I have to tell you, I'm not very good at coloring within the lines. And so as soon as I see the word scope, I'm ready to move beyond it. And to some extent, I'll be doing that in this presentation. The other thought that crossed my mind was, in referring to this as a wicked problem, I gave a talk a few years ago in reaction to somebody else talking about wicked problems, and the talk was called "Wicked Problems Need Virtuous Solutions." And so I hope that at the end here, I'm going to give you some, what I think might be some virtuous solutions. So with that as preamble, let me just share my screen here and we'll get the show on the road. Just give that a moment. There we go. So, as I said, I'm not good at coloring within the lines, so I'm going to talk about climate change and community safety, giving you the big picture. And this is the big picture. This is the wicked problem. This was a very important speech by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres a couple of 5 months ago now, in which he talked about the state of the planet, and he said, humanity is waging war on nature. This is senseless and suicidal. So I think the first and most, not necessarily the most important, but one important point is to understand that climate change is not simply sitting there all on its own as if it's the only ecological threat we face. It's one component of a set of global ecological changes that are underway, and I've listed the main ones here. And if you're familiar with the language around planetary boundaries, you'll see that this largely represents the planetary boundaries. And I'd say that the sort of the end game, if you like, is species extinction. So we have triggered a sixth great extinction. And the problem is that all of these are happening at the same time. So climate change isn't acting in isolation. It's acting at the same time as all of these other things are happening. And generally speaking, they all reinforce each other in negative ways. And so collectively, one way to think about this is the Anthropocene. And it constitutes an existential challenge, which is exactly the point that Antonio Guterres was making. And it is both the scale of this change and the rapidity of this change that matters. And I think we've not really, as a society, wrapped our heads around this very much. So here is both the rapidity, particularly the rapidity, but also the scale of these changes. On the left, a set of socioeconomic changes. On the right, a set of Earth system changes. These come out of the Stockholm Resilience Center and the International Geosphere Biosphere Program a few years ago. What's important is that those red arrows represent 1950. And so you can see how massively things have changed socioeconomically and in terms of the related impact on Earth systems. And top left there is carbon dioxide, but you'll see methane top right, ocean acidification below that, things like marine fish capture further down on the left, and so on, all accelerating dramatically in that period since 1950. 1950 is within my lifetime. I was born in 1948, so all of those changes that we just showed, they all happened in my lifetime. In geological, in ecological terms, that is incredibly rapid change. And it's triggered by us. And you can see on the left some of the scale of that change in terms of socioeconomic trends, and on the right, the Earth system trends. And this was only, because it's rather an old slide now, data till about 10 years ago. So it's beyond that, it's worse than that. And so the war on nature, it's the second point, which brings us to more of this discussion, is that the war on nature, and I am largely going to talk from here on about climate change itself, has local consequences. So yes, it's a global event, but it threatens community safety. It threatens it through severe weather events, fires, flooding, all the things that Felix already listed. So one of the things we can expect is mass evacuations as cities flood, as cities burn, as urban heat events happen, and for a variety of other reasons. Mass evacuations can result in looting. We're familiar with these issues. We've seen them before. Other forms of civil unrest. And on top of that, heat events may increase the potential for violence. With increased heat, you get increased violence and crime. Health Canada, in a report on this last year, reported that extreme heat can also result in increased aggression and violence. And a report in 2019 that looked at overall crime in LA and showed an increase in days with maximum daily temperatures. Now, I've also seen research that suggests that that happens more in more normal temperatures, normal high temperatures, that extreme high temperatures may drive people back indoors, I guess, or into that. But in any case, there's certainly something going on that needs to be kept an eye on, and the potential for the combination of mass evacuation and heat and increased tensions and all the rest of it. So this is one of the many sources of potential increases in crime and violence and lack of community safety. And I am largely talking about lack of community safety in the way that Felix outlined it. But of course, we shouldn't forget, if I just go back for one moment, that fires and flooding and extreme weather events and so on affect safety in the sense that people get injured, people get sick, people get killed. Not because of crime or violence, but because of the events themselves. So they affect community safety both in the sense of increasing unintentional injury and illness, as well as in the sense of increasing crime and violence. The second thing which Felix emphasized is that the consequences of climate change will be, or already are, inequitable. Low-income populations, older people, people who, for example, don't have access to air conditioning, marginalized, racialized, and indigenous populations. Generally speaking, these people not only live without air conditioning, but one of my mantras that I repeat for cities time and again is that the poor live downwind, downstream, and downhill. And you can see that very clearly in the geography of cities. Why do you think London's West End is rich and its East End is poor, traditionally? Well, the West End is upwind and upstream. And that's where you went if you could afford to live there. And it made the property there more valuable. And so if you were poor, you ended up downhill and downwind and downstream in London, and that put you down in the East End. They also live closer to the dangerous industries and waste dumps and so on that might be adversely affected by severe weather events or by flooding. And so there's the potential for the resulting social injustice of all of this as it becomes more extreme to dissolve into civil unrest. So this is another source of danger, is simply that the impacts of this of climate change and more broadly of global change will be inequitably felt. It may get to the point indeed that these global changes undermine the basics needed for survival: water and food and shelter and clean air and so on. And from that, you can expect international or even the subnational resource wars. Why would Alberta ship its beef to BC when BC won't take its fossil fuels? Or there was a famous line back in the 1980s when there was a cold weather and a fossil fuel problem. Those eastern bastards can freeze in the dark, was some of the language being used out in the West. So the potential for that to happen within as well as between countries is very real as water becomes more scarce or food becomes more scarce and so on. And those consequences again will be felt both locally and inequitably. So what if drought and other crises do lead to rationing of water and food? Might there be water or food riots? We need to be thinking about that. And of course, how do you prevent them? Which has to do with making sure that there isn't a shortage of water and food. Then there is, at a larger scale in some respects, a great transition. So we're going to have to make a transition to a green, sustainable, call it what you will, economy. And that is going to displace workers. And we can see it already around concerns around fossil fuel workers, miners, and the like. And you can expect resentment, you can expect reaction to job loss as a result of that. You can expect to see more of what in America they've been calling the diseases of death and deaths of despair. So increases in deaths related to tobacco, to suicide, alcohol use, and drug use. We've also seen an increase in domestic violence during COVID, and if you start to get fossil fuel and other industries, unsustainable industries, winding down, should we be expecting to see an increase in domestic violence as well, as these economic transitions happen? And the potential for radicalization is real, and some in fact would argue that this has fueled the phenomenon of Trump and the right-wing militias and so on, the sense of aggrievement, of the sense of injustice, the sense of resentment as Rust Belt industries decline and no alternative is presented. And then we have climate anxiety. This was a couple of years ago, 18 months ago now, here in Victoria, outside our legislature. This was the young people leading the climate strikes. And as that poster wonderfully said, as the sea level rises, so does my anxiety. Well, that may in turn fuel civil unrest. And so while on the one hand, it energizes young activists, as the Times columnist here in Victoria noted, we've also seen Extinction Rebellion. And I think that, frankly, what they do is relatively mild, but the potential for that to escalate as the crisis gets worse, I think, is very real. And we see right now here in BC, just 50 miles from where I am sitting, there is a conflict between police trying to enforce an injunction to prevent protesters who are blockading loggers who are trying to access old growth timber and cut it down. And you can expect to see more civil unrest around that issue, as we've seen in the past, the so-called war in the woods in the 90s here in BC. So I think the potential for this to fuel civil unrest in cities is very real. So those are some of the big picture issues. So I said wicked problems need virtuous solutions. I'm going to try and present some what I consider to be virtuous solutions. And my theme for this is actually taken from the same speech by Antonio Guterres, who, following on from what he said about making war on nature, said immediately after, making peace with nature is the defining task of the coming decades. It's work I'm very much involved with here. Since I've retired, I've set up a small NGO called Conversations for a One Planet Region, which is all about how do we talk about these challenges that I've just outlined, these and even larger challenges, and how do we think about what it means for us to become a one planet region, which means a 70% reduction in our ecological footprint. So we're not talking about small changes here. We're talking about massive societal change, massive economic change and transition. And as I've already outlined, all of that brings with it the potential for civil unrest. So how might we respond? Well, how do we make peace with nature, and how do we build community safety while making peace with nature? What would making peace with nature look like? And how could our communities be made safer and healthier? And I think we've learned some things from COVID, and these are some of the things I've talked about this in the past, and in my columns, I write a weekly column for the local newspaper. I've talked about the things we've learned from COVID, and I call it the COVID reveal. And these are some of the things I think COVID has revealed. That community matters, that how we behave towards each other really matters, that, that whether you believe that wearing your mask and keeping a social distance and doing all those other things not only is protecting you, but protecting your community, or whether you believe, on the other hand, the community doesn't matter and why should I have to wear a mask or be socially distanced. So community matters, connection matters. The mere fact that we keep on meeting using all of these technologies, we like to and need to talk to and connect with each other. And I would add, incidentally, that part of the connection that matters, as I note right at the bottom, is that nature matters, and that connection to nature matters, that caring matters, caring for each other, that equity matters. I think one of the most important reveals of COVID is that the people who are most essential to our well-being, the people who grow and distribute our food and look after our water and sewage and all the rest of it, are often among the lowest paid and least secure jobs. So we've got our priorities wrong there, that equity matters, that making a decent living with a secure job matters to people. Sharing the burden matters, that relates to that. So all of the money we've seen shoveled out of the door to support people so that society doesn't fall apart, so that people don't fall apart. You can imagine what might have happened if we hadn't done that in terms of civil unrest. So in order to get from where we are to where we need to be, we're going to need what some people call a Green New Deal. Others call it a just transition. I just called it a one planet community. Kate Raworth calls it a donut economy. These are all facets of the same thing, and they are about, in fact, what Felix and Roxanne talked about, or I think it was Manuel actually, in terms of what virus is all about, what your center is all about, which is community, environment, equity, and community. That's really what we're talking about here. How do we make a socially just transition to a community that meets basic needs for all, what Kate Raworth calls the social foundation, while living within the ecological ceiling, her term again, of one planet? And as I've said, that means a massive shift. So we're going to need to do this because we do only have one planet, and how we do it is going to make it's going to be very important. So I think that if making peace with nature is the defining task of the coming decades, we need to foster a sense of social solidarity. We need to recognize the need to transition or transform into a community that has made peace with nature and done so in a socially just way. And I would argue that if you want to ensure community safety in a time of the Anthropocene, then in the time of global ecological change and the time of climate change, then we're going to need some kind of larger purpose to bring us together, such as the one I just outlined. So can we engage people across our communities, all ages, and in all of our diversity in this one central and lifelong challenge of our age? This is the challenge of the 21st century. How are we going to make a just transition to a one planet society? And in doing so, we could build social cohesion. We could recognize that community and connection and caring all matter and make that a central part of that transition. And in doing so, we could reduce dramatically the risk of social disparity, of exclusion, of conflict, and we could thus enhance community safety in the face of climate change. So that's the challenge I think we face as individuals, as communities, as cities, as societies in the remaining 79 years of the 21st century and beyond.